Today we're going to talk about one of the most important foundations for democratic stability, political legitimacy. I'm going to explain what political legitimacy is and where it comes from. What are the multiple sources of causation of political legitimacy, both in general for all political systems and for a democracy. The most basic way to define legitimacy is that it's an attitude, it's a belief that the system of government in place in the country is the best one for the country, that it's morally right, it deserves to be there, it's proper, it can be justified, and therefore it deserves to be complied with, that its authority should be accepted, that it has a right to expect certain things from citizens. So legitimacy is a moral title to rule, to command obedience from citizens. In order for any state to function, it needs a certain degree of compliance from the citizenry. A state needs to be able to raise resources from its citizenry, unless it's a very rich oil state, and we'll be talking about it later in this class. It needs to be able to extract resources to tax. It needs to be able to demand compliance from the citizens for the laws that it legislates in one way or another. If a state goes to war, it may need to be able to draft its citizens and get compliance for that function. Of course, in a democracy, that decision should only be made democratically. But all of these things require citizen consent, citizen compliance. And the question arises as to why citizens should do that. And they're only going to do that voluntarily if they believe that the system of government in place in the country that is exercising state authority is morally right and proper and deserves to have their allegiance. Now, the thing about democracy is that it is unique among political systems in terms of its need for political legitimacy. All political systems rely to some extent on a mix of coercion and consent. Even in the worst days of Saddam Hussein in Iraq or the current regime in North Korea, if everyone were to withdraw their consent immediately, the system could be destabilized. So there needs to be some degree of control over information, very large propaganda apparatus in totalitarian regimes to manufacture this kind of consent. And to reinforce it, obviously, in an authoritarian regime, and even more so in a totalitarian regime, with an extreme level of coercion. But democracies are different. They restrain themselves from the use of coercion, and they depend to a unique degree in relation to all other forms of government on the consent of the governed. It's not that coercion isn't there, it is there. It can be used against people who violate the law, against criminals, against terrorists, against people who protest in ways that exceed the boundaries of peaceful democratic rules of the game. But if a democracy does not get voluntary consent from the citizens, it can't function effectively. There's another reason why democracies depend to a unique degree on legitimacy in order to function effectively and be stable. In contrast to authoritarian regimes, which either limit the degree of political pluralism, competition, and conflict, or rule it out altogether, ban political parties, ban interest groups, ban expressions of protest and of interest representation. This by contrast, is the lifeblood of a democracy. A democracy depends on the peaceful play of competing political, social, and economic interests. This means that in a democracy, there must, by definition, be conflict, competition between competing interests. And the question then becomes, it is the generic question that governs the quest for democratic effectiveness and democratic stability. How can this competition, this conflict between competing interests, and maybe even in some respects competing values, be kept within certain boundaries so it doesn't descend into violence and chaos, for example, in the way that mass violence erupted after the December 2007 elections in Kenya, where there were tens of thousands of refugees and many people killed in the wake of post-election violence. So this then brings us to a search for causation. What determines regime legitimacy? There are basically 6 possible causes or sources of regime legitimacy, and I want to just briefly introduce each one. Then we'll talk about them in specific detail. First of all, regimes can become legitimate, can become valued and seen to be morally right and worthy of obedience because of their performance. People come to see that they work, that they deliver what people want in terms of economic outputs and in terms of political outputs, and so they give the state, the political system, compliance as a result of that. Secondly, they may be valued as a result of what they represent in terms of norms and values. Third, the social structure of the country may be such that it contributes to political legitimacy. And this doesn't necessarily mean that it's democratic. A political system in which there's basically an authoritarian structure of power may rest on deeply unequal and clientelistic relations in a kind of pyramidal arrangement where there's a top leader or domineering social figure, maybe a traditional ruler in a local area, a king or prince, who is seen as having the right to exercise authority. Below him are other figures of authority who give obedience to the king and who command resources and have very strong ties of obedience below them, and this may cascade down in a pyramidal relationship of patron-client relations. This may be the social structure of the country, even to the point of semi-feudal relations, where ordinary people have no secure land, no secure income, are virtually serfs of their local power brokers. And if people think this is the inevitable social structure, it's the way their ancestors had lived, it's the way their children will live, they may come to accept it unless there's some kind of developmental or social or political intervention that leads them to question this social structure. Then fourth, there's political institutions, and some political institutions work better than others, particularly in a democracy, to generate effective performance. We'll talk about that. Leadership can make a difference, particularly early on in the life of a democracy. If leaders govern effectively with respect for the rules and institutions of democracy, they may help to bring about a more legitimate political system. And finally, there's a class of variables that we'll be exploring later in this course that has to do with the international environment. Does the democracy exist within a region of other democracies so that democracy is a broadly accepted regional norm? Does the democracy get assistance and support from other democracies in the world, or is it constantly undermined and challenged by authoritarian regimes or even historically other democracies that may see its leadership and values as threatening in some way?